Hi, I'm Cheri Carlson from Artbeads.com, and today I'm going to show you how to weave a bracelet on the Cheri Loom, how to set it up, what to do when you run out of thread while you're in the middle of weaving, how to finish that woven section off, and then how to add a button and loop closure. So this is the bracelet piece that we're going to do. I'm going to show you how to go about setting up the loom for this project. This bracelet has 7 rows of beads, and so you're going to put 8 warp threads onto the loom, 1 thread for each bead and then 1 to the outside. I finished this with a button and then a loop closure, which I'll show you how to do that as well. But first you need to set up the loom. The really neat thing about the Cheri Loom is that the thread is warped on continuously. So in the end, you only have a few warp threads to tie back into your finished piece, and you'll see that magic happen when we get there. But first we need to set the loom up. And this is called the headstock, and then we have a tailstock here, and this tailstock slides along this little rod, and then there's wing nuts here that allow you to move this up and back and forth for the length of the piece that you want to make. What I like to do first is put these warp rods in place. They slide through the little eye loops. You slide the little stoppers in place, and that holds them securely. So you want to do that on both ends. And then you want to measure, your threads are going to wrap around the outside of each of these warp rods, and that's the literal length of the woven section of your piece. So you want to measure the distance with these rods as if there were thread adding tension to the rods, and then adjust this tailstock one way or the other to get the right length. So then you adjust this wing nut until it's nice and tight and secure, and you can do that on both sides. And then you want to check your measurement again, because this tailstock will either lean forward or backwards. You want it nice and firm. And then I like to lay a ruler over and measure the length to the right distance for the piece that you're going to weave. The thread I'm using is KO, but you can use all kinds of different thread. Fireline works great as well for loom weaving. Then you're going to take one of these pegs and you're going to insert the thread in the slot in the peg, like so. And then I like to wrap the end around a few times, and I've given myself about a foot. I may use this extra thread for adding the button or the loop, or maybe starting some edge trim on my piece, so I like to give myself plenty of extra. And then this peg is going to get inserted in the second hole over. I'm going to leave the first hole vacant, and that's where my threading, my needle sewing thread is going to be. So I've got this nice and secure, and now I'm going to take my thread and I'm going to go over the warp rod, and then I'm going to go over the one on the far end and then bring my thread through. So by using a spool that's small enough, you can leave your thread on the spool when you warp the loom. If you're working with thread that's on a large spool, you're not going to be able to do that. And so now I'm going under, and then over, under, and over. And I'm keeping this snug. I'm not pulling it so tight that it's pulling on the warp rods but just nice and secure. And then you want to count. I have 7 rows of beads, so that means I need 7 spaces or gaps for my beads and 8 threads. And I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 spaces, so I need 1 more. And this will be my last one. So typically, if I were going to continue warping, I would go under this warp rod, but because it's my last one, I'm going to go over the top. Now, if the number of beads was different and I wanted to end at this end of the loom, then I would turn this around and secure my end thread to this side. But it works out for this particular one to end on this side of the loom. And then again, I'm going to pull off, I like about 1 foot. And then I'm going to put that on one of the pegs, wrap it a few times so it's good and secure, and then position it in one of the other holes. And then the placement of this depends on how large or how wide the piece is that you're going to be working on. And then I just kind of straighten up my threads. We're going to adjust those again as we move forward. The next thing that you do is you take this warp separator card, and this is going to position itself here on the loom so that when we do our first few rows, we're building out here, which is less clumsy than trying to get your needle in up against this warp rod. And so to do that, we're going to go over and under the threads, alternating to the end, and then just slide that in place. Then we're ready for our weft thread. This is the one that is on the needle that you actually stitch the beads with. And you're going to, again, put the thread through the slot in the peg, wrap it around a few times, and then position it on the end of your loom. If you're right-handed, it'll go to your left side. If you're left-handed, it'll go to your right side. And I have my needle on already, and I'm going to bring that around and under the loom. So I've got it attached here, and I'm under my warp threads and ready to go. So I like to print out my pattern ahead of time, and I like to print it as large as possible so it's easy to see. And then I just use a little sticky note and place it above the row that I'm working on, so it's real visual. I don't have to count back or double check where I'm at. I just know that this is the next row that I'm doing. So now it's time to pick up the beads on the needle. So I'm looking at my pattern and I see that I need a background bead, and then I've got my shiny stripe, and then another background, a turquoise, a background, a shiny copper, and then another background bead. So those are loaded on my needle. And working underneath these threads, I'm just going to pull the beads until I don't have any slack, and then we're going to position them between the threads. So the first few rows are the trickiest, and I'm only going to worry about the first few at a time, and I can get my needle through the first 3. They're where they need to be, and I'm making sure that my needle is going through the bead but staying on top of these warp threads. You don't want to go under the warp thread or the bead will fall off. And you do want to be careful not to pierce your threads with your needle. Sometimes you can even turn the needle backwards and thread with the eye first if that's something that you're worried about. Now, to get this next bead in place, I want to get that turquoise bead in there, and that one's ready, and then my copper one even is in a good place, so I'm catching those, and then my last bead. So I've got all the beads threaded through on the needle, and then I'm going to pull the thread nice and snug in place. I don't want to pull so tight that it's pulling down on my warp threads like that. I want to keep that straight. And now you can see I've got a lot of gaps between the warp threads. So I want to adjust that a little bit, bring those in a little closer on both ends of the loom. And my weft thread then is ready for the next row of beads. So then I look at my next row and I see I've got a background and a shiny. And then I'm sliding the beads up the thread, and you can see that this time the beads almost go into place by themselves. I'm pushing them up with my finger so that the holes are above the warp threads, and then I can get my needle, through, making sure I'm on top of those warp threads all the way through. And then just tightening up that weft thread again. So that's the second row. We're going to do, you can do anywhere from 2 to maybe 4 rows. It depends on your bead size before we slide them back to the headstock. So I'm going to do one more. So now I'm going to remove the warp separator card, and we're going to slide these beads back. You can either use your fingers or you can use the warp separator card to push those back, whatever works best. And then I'm going to adjust my warp threads so that they're nice and even on both ends. And then you continue beading. Okay, so you can see that I've continued on with the pattern, but I don't have much thread left. So what do you do about this? How do you finish off this thread and start a new one? There are a couple different ways you can go about this. You can weave this thread back into your loomed piece. You'd come through this hole and you'd go through a few beads and then bring your thread down, go back through a few beads, and then you can circle around in this bead pattern to secure this thread. Or you can go in a few beads, tie a little knot around the existing weft thread that's running through the beads, move over a few beads, tie another little knot, and then weave your tail in. And that would be going back into the work you've already done. Or you can leave this tail, and then when you're done with this project and you've taken it off the loom and you're ready to tie off all your threads, you can weave this thread forward into the new beads that you've started. So right now I'm going to show you that process of weaving it off just so you can see what that's like. So I'm going to go backwards into the end row, and I'm going to go through a few beads and then out. And then I'm going to catch my thread, and you can poke the thread up or your piece up so that you can find that thread. You can see it's there. My needle is underneath it. And then I'm going to pull that through until I have a small loop, and then I'm going to put my needle through that loop and then pull that down, and that forms a little half knot. Then I'm going to continue through to the next bead or two and out. From here on, I'm not going to go outside of my edge beads. I want to keep the thread within the body of the work. And then I want this thread to run between these beads. You don't want to be going over beads. So the thread is going to run from here to here. I'm going to go through a couple beads, and then you can see that that thread just tucks itself in there nicely and you can hardly see it. And then I'm going to catch another weft thread. So I'm going to tighten up that knot and then go through a few beads again, pulls that knot inside a bead, move down a row, weave through a few beads. Might even go up a row. Whoops. Out one bead. Back down a row. If you circle around a little bit, it tends to tighten the thread up. So I kind of like to do that. And then out a couple. And so that's the technique that you would use whether you go forward into the new beads that you've created or go backwards to tie it off. And then I'm going to remove my needle and I'm going to get rid of this little tail so it's out of my way. So now I've got a new length of thread and I'm going to use the same technique to weave this new thread into the beads. I'm not going to come in from the outside because that's going to leave a tail on the outside, and I run the risk of snipping my other threads while cutting that. So I like to go somewhere, again, in the body of the beads, go through a few beads. I'm not going to pull that thread all the way through. I'm going to leave this tail, and then I'm going to catch my, whoops, my weft thread, pull it down till I have a little loop, just like I did before. I've threaded my needle through that loop and then I'm going to pull that snug. And then I'm going to then I'm going to go up through a few beads. I didn't hide that knot in a bead. I would probably go over one more if I weren't at the end to hide that knot a little better. Go over. Through my loop again. Pull that snug. So now I have a couple knots, and now I need this thread to be coming out of this end hole where I left off. So I'm going to just weave my way that direction. So now I'm back to where I started with a nice new length of thread. And then I'm going to come in real close with my little scissors and snip that tail. I'm staying, you see, I'm staying on top of the beads and snipping. I'm not getting down in there where I run the risk of cutting my other threads. And then you continue on with your project until you reach the end. So you can see that I've come to the end and I'm bumping against my warp rod. If you turn your piece to look at the edge, if you are pulling on the beads and bunching them up, then your piece is going to be lumpy and you're going to have too many beads within the length of the thread that you're working with. If you have too few beads, then when you're done, you're going to get gapping between the rows. And so ideally you want to come somewhere in between where it's nice and solid but not bunching. We're going to take the piece off these warp rods, but you can see that there's space still, that when we slide these warp rods out, the beads are going to move into that space at both ends. And so how do you know if you have enough beads within your piece? And so what I've found is it's better to have one row too many because you can easily remove that row of beads after the fact. But if you don't have enough, it's much harder to work that last row back into your warp. But you're going to see that it's pretty tricky. Like, how in the world am I going to get beads into this tight little space? So what I'm going to do is just bunch up the beads a bit and make some room for myself here. So now I'm going to pick up the last row of beads. And so this last row can be kind of tricky. I like to try and get the beads snapped into place ahead of time, but it may be so snug that you're not able to do all of them at once. I've got those in pretty well. But you want to make sure that you're getting above the warp threads because every other one is coming up really high and easy to get that needle underneath it. So I just like to kind of take it one bead at a time. You can see it's a little clumsy up against this warp rod. Oh, there we go. So over, I'm going to try and push that bead up. There we go. And then last bead, and then through. Now I'm going to leave this needle in here and just double check in between these beads and see. Yes, I think think I'm over all my warp threads, and then I'm going to pull it through and then check, and they should lay nice and even. If they're not, then you've probably missed a bead. So now we're done weaving, and if I look at my edge, we're a little bunchy, but I think that after we take these off the rods, that'll probably smooth out. And like I said, if not, then we can always pull a row of beads out pretty easily. So I'm going to remove my needle, and I'm going to take all my pegs off. And then I'm going to take one end off the warp rod and the other. And then you can see this end came right off, and then I'm going to slide that one off. Get all my threads going in the right direction. You're just going to slowly move, gently slide these beads back and forth and smooth them out, and then you'll decide whether or not you need to take a row out or if it's just right. And depending on the thread that you've used, it has been warped around the rods with some tension, and then once you remove them, the thread is going to find its way back to its original self. And so if you let the piece rest for a while, that allows the thread enough time to do that, and you may find that it snugs up or loosens a little bit. But what I like to do then is to check my edge and see if it's bunched up at all, or if I have a lot of gaps. And you can see there's little gaps here and there, but it's not too bunchy. And then those will just kind of smooth out. And as you put this type of piece around your wrist, the beads tend to smooth and lay out nice as well. So I think we're good. I think we're going to not take a row out, and I don't think we need to add a row. So I think we're ready to tie the threads to secure them. And as you can see, one of the really nice things about the Rix loom is that at the far end of the work, the only tail I have to work into the piece is the end of the weft thread. And then at the beginning end, I have only 3 threads, 1 weft and then 2 warp threads. On a traditional loom, you're going to have a thread for every row sticking out on each end of the bracelet that you need to do something with. So this is one of the really neat things about the Rix loom. Now I'm going to do a button and loop closure on this piece, and so I'm going to leave a thread on each end long enough to do that, but I do want to secure all the threads first before I add the loop and button. So I want to finish off the weft thread, and it's coming out of an end bead, so I'm going to go back in the other end and then go through a few beads, just like we did when we added thread and ended thread. I'm going to tie off and make a knot as before. I'm going through that loop Pulling it snug, going through a bead that hides that knot inside the bead. And then I'm going to flip this over. I'm going to go down a row, through a few beads. You can see that thread gets hidden in the row there. Catching my weft threads, going through the little loop and pulling it snug again, and oops, over a bead. If these were really tiny beads, the knotting almost isn't necessary as long as you do a nice series of weaving back and forth and switching directions. But when the beads are loose on the threads, I like the added security of the knots. But now I'm going to add my button. And so I want to be up in here, so I'm going to maneuver my thread through the beads to get the needle where I want it. So I'm coming out of this center bead to one side, and I'm going to add a couple beads to my needle and then slide them down into place. And then this is my button, and I'm going to run the needle through the shank on the button. There we go. Going to get the shank going the right direction. And then I'm going to go back through the two beads that I added. And we're going to pull that down to the row. I'm not going to get too tight right now. We'll snug it up as we go. And then I'm going to go back through this middle bead, maybe easier if we turn the work around. I'm going to go back through the middle bead, and then I'm going to add two beads on this side of the center bead. Slide them into place, and then I'm going to go up through the shank again, and then back down through those two beads. And then I'm going to work on the tension. You can see that I've got the 4 beads lined up and the threads going through the button, but it's pretty loose and not super secure. You want to go back through those beads and around the shank of that button several times for security. If I were just simply to circle around and around through here, you're going to build up a lot of thread, particularly in this center button. So sometimes I like to go around and through some other beads to spread that out, and I think it makes it a little more secure. In this case, I'm coming down, I'm going through the center bead, but I'm going to go over a bead, maybe, and then bring the needle down and work my way back up, go through those beads to secure. So it just kind of depends on the weight of the button, the size of the beads. Of course, the smaller the beads, the less room you have for going through multiple times. But for now, I'm just going to go through the center bead just to show you that it does get more secure as you go through multiple times. So I'm going to go up through again. I'm going to go through the shank. I could even loop through the shank a few times at this point just to get more thread around it, making it a little more secure. You want to make sure that you're pulling that thread snug, and then back down through the two beads. And so you're just going to continue to do that until you feel that your button is nice and secure. And then you're going to tie those threads off just like you've been doing with the other loose threads by working it down into the weave of your piece. And so there's the button end. I'm going to trim that thread so it's out of my way. And then I'm going to move down for the loop. And I like to do the button first because it's nice and secure, and then it makes it so much easier to determine the loop size that you need for that button. But before I can do the loop, I have 3 threads to deal with. And so I'm going to tie all 3 off so that they're secure, just like I did at the other end. But then I'm going to leave 1 thread for working the loop. Okay, so I've tied off all the threads but 1, and I've moved it in position for my loop, for my button. The loop that I made starts out with a couple beads. I actually start with a turquoise and then the orange, and then I go around adding the others and then back through the orange, and then I'm going to add a turquoise. But you may not know how many beads to add for your button, so I like to get as many beads as I think are going to fit on my thread, and then circle through once and then test that around the button to see if it's a good fit. And I have this in a little pattern, which makes that testing a little more difficult because you'll need to either add or remove beads for your pattern. If it's all one bead, then it's real easy to test if it's all one bead color. And so there's the beginning of my loop, and I happen to know that this loop fits this button size, but you may be creating your own pattern and not be sure of the length. And so I'm going to go ahead and run that through my orange bead and snug that up, which gives me my loop. And then I'm going to hold the thread snug and then test to see if my button fits through, and it fits pretty well. So I'm going to go a little further by adding my last turquoise bead and then going through, I'm going to actually go through the center bead and then the next outside bead. And then snug that up. And then again, at this point, now that's a little more snug. You don't want to pull it so tight that your beads are bunchy, but you want to make sure that that loop is going to fit around that button, like so. And then you're going to weave through a few beads down below, back up, and then circle around through that bead loop again so that you have 2 threads running through the whole loop, and you can even do that a 3rd time if you want, which just adds security, makes that loop stronger. And then you're going to tie off your bead threads just like you've been doing for the button and for any of the loose warp threads. And that's it.